The Bob Murphy Show, episode 324.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews, conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Bob Murphy Show. Today, it's going to be a little bit different. I'm speaking with Clint Russell. You might say, well, Bob, you don't have political figures on. Right, because he just returned to honest work. So, because I am now eligible to talk to Clint, I had it on the show as soon as possible. So we're going to talk about his background. He comes from the mortgage industry, so we talk a lot about Federal Reserve, housing bubble, that sort of thing, current prognosis. But then we transition to the fun stuff, the drama, asking him about the Libertarian National Convention, where some allege hijinks were afoot. So without further ado, here is my discussion with the host of the Liberty Lockdown podcast and former candidate for VP for the Libertarian Party, Clint Russell. Clint, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Senor Roberto Murphy. It is an honor and a pleasure, sir. Thanks for having me.
Sure thing. So I'm trying to think of where to begin, and so I'm bumping some other episodes. I'm gonna have this run as soon as possible because I know some of this is gonna be fairly time sensitive in the sense of asking you about the convention. But maybe before we get into that, can you just explain? So I mean, I knew of you. You know, you had a podcast that you were the host of, and then that sort of got on my radar. I don't know, 2 years ago or something like that. And I just started seeing more and more people talking about who's this Clint guy. So for one thing, you've got a very rugged name, and are you quite possibly the most rugged person in the libertarian movement?
Oh man, I hope not. I'm sure we got some libertarians in Appalachia that are much more rugged than me. I'm in posh Skyline in Miami. I'm certainly not rugged, but I do try to go to the gym. I shave my head and I have a goatee, so I kind of look tough, even though I'm kind of a softie. So, it's yes and no.
Let me ask you about that. Like, as someone in my situation, I've noticed when I go and get my hair cut, like now I err on the side of like, no, the clipper, gets really short. And there's a certain, I'm just going to come out and say it. If I go into Starbucks right after I get my hair cut, I feel like the girls, they pay me more attention. And so I'm wondering, does that scale where if I literally just went bald, would that work even better? I don't mean with the girls at Starbucks. I'm just saying in general, like there's still a hesitation, I guess, on my part to just take it all off.
Bob,
yes,
join me in the dark side, brother. This is
all right.
This is the way to go. Look, I could still grow, a decent head of hair, to be honest, but it's I'm gray. I don't like dyeing it, and so I'm just like, I'll just shave the whole thing. Joe Rogan was really the one that convinced me because he was hanging on to his hair for decades, doing hair plugs and everything else, and once he shaved it, he looked good. So I was like, I'll just do that, and I haven't looked back. I'm very happy with it. So yes, I welcome you into the arms of the bald brethren.
There's Michael Jordan, Bruce Willis. Yeah,
that's right, man.
It's okay. Yeah,
Jason Statham. Come on.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So how did you get into? So I will say, I knew of you. I kept getting, and then the thing that really is, you were recently on the podcast. Oh shoot, was it? Is it Peter Boghossian? Yeah, Boghossian. Yeah. That was the one where I think that's the longest I've heard you go, and I hope you're taking this as a compliment. I was like, wow, Clint really knows his stuff. And
well, thank you.
So how did that happen? Was it a gradual thing, or like were you a nerd on this stuff 10 years ago?
Well, yeah, my story is pretty unique in that my dad found libertarianism in the 1970s. So I was born in the 80s. even though I wasn't raised by my biological dad, I was raised by my mom and my stepdad. I would spend one weekend a month with my biological dad, and he owned this nightclub in Ridgecrest, California, which was like a 5-hour drive from where I was growing up. So he would just spend these 5-hour round trip, it was 10 hours round trip, one weekend a month, and we would just father-son time, and he would tell me all about the founding fathers and about Austrian economics, and I was 5 and 6 and 7 years old, and I know that sounds totally insane, but that was my first exposure to libertarian thought. I remember, I think the first book I read was How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World by Harry Brown, and from there, obviously, in high school I would debate all my friends. We would get drunk, and I would try and convince them that we don't need the government to produce roads, stupid stuff like that you do at house parties. And then, by the time I was an adult, that was when the Ron Paul revolution was starting to take off, or I was, mid-20s, and it was just like, oh, wow, like there's a guy that has my ideas that is popularizing them somehow. I went from being the crazy guy that no one had ever heard any of these ideas to, oh, you're one of those end the Fed people like Ron Paul. And I was like, yeah, I am. Like, that's exactly who I am. And then, after that, I started a mortgage company. I worked for over 10 years just as an entrepreneur, very focused on, personal self-growth, relationships, and wealth building. And then the lockdowns happened, and I was radicalized into oblivion, very inspired by Dave Smith after I first found him on Rogan in 2016. And once I started my show in 2020, a year later, I basically bought my way into Dave's good graces by donating $1,000 to the Mises Caucus, and he agreed to come on my show. Ever since then, we've become really good friends, and everyone in this world, all my heroes have embraced me. Scott Horton, yourself, Tom Woods, Dave, the list goes on and on. So, that's the arc. It's a weird one, but no, I am not new to the ideology. I've very much grown up with it.
Okay, great. And your show is specifically, like, the name has to do with the lockdowns, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I started it in May of 2020. So that was definitely the impetus to do so. But it covers far more than that. My expertise is really in finance. So I talk a lot about that. I talk a lot about the economy. I talk a lot about, why everything is kind of trickle down effect of central banking and why so much of our cultural decay is a product of that. And then I also I'm fiercely anti-war. So I cover, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine. I basically do, a B-list version of what Dave does as far as I'm concerned.
I was going to say you're like Dave without hair.
Yes.
Yeah. So you were in mortgages like during the housing bubble years then? Or
yeah, I came out of
timing off.
No, that's right. I came out of college right into the teeth of the Great Recession. So I finished college in 2008, and after some dilly-dallying, I went and worked at Verizon Wireless as a sales rep for a couple of years in between. But yeah, I graduated in 2008, went right into the mortgage industry, and ended up, I worked for my family because there was really very few people that were hiring at that time. So I worked for my dad for a few years and was responsible for liquidating hundreds of foreclosed properties. And it really drove home, the human consequences of central banking, and a lot of other, bigger issues than just central banking too. But because I was in charge of that, I got to see, the cost, and it was brutal. It just convinced me that we were right, but it also kind of radicalized me against the system in a way. But a few years later, I started my own company after I had helped basically get my dad out of out of hell, and then I had a very successful career up until the lockdowns.
Okay, so because I was going to ask, armed with Austrian economics, did you see any of that coming? But you weren't like in that professionally, when the bust first
but I
hit.
Still knew. I mean, I was telling all my friends when I was in college, because I had a handful of friends that had gone out and bought houses in that bubble. So 05, 06, 07, particularly 06 and 07, I was telling everybody that I knew to sell. I was like, you have to get out. Like, this is absolutely unsustainable. I didn't understand the full depth of it. I didn't understand the derivatives markets. the way I do now. So it was more it was more cataclysmic than even I was prognosticating. But yes, I was definitely in tune enough with the market to know it was coming and to warn people at that time. So yeah, I did know.
Did you see the movie The Big Short?
Oh yeah.
How do you feel about that?
I mean, it's a great movie, but it's not entirely accurate. I'd have to rewatch it to give all of my, in the weeds critiques. But I remember it just being, I don't think that they put nearly enough blame on the ratings agencies. They did mention it in passing, but it was still, the focus is always just on greed. And it's like, greed doesn't go away. Like greed is perennial. It's going to exist. So I think that my biggest frustration with it is that the reason that those derivatives markets and the tranches of securities that were being rated BBB and et cetera, that were in fact trash, like that was a product of a captured market, a captured regulatory agency by the corporations, and the government work hand in hand. I mean, you have the Federal Reserve that's ultimately backing all of this, and then you have these kind of GSEs, these spin-offs, the Fannies and Freddies. Like they just didn't do a good job of explaining that like this is not a free market phenomenon. And if they would to emphasize that, then my libertarian autism would have been assuaged.
Yeah, my reaction to it is similar. Is that I thought it was fine insofar as it went, and you're right. Like it was just a good movie. Like it was amazing.
Great
they
movie.
could make a movie about such a sort of dry topic that was riveting. Well, maybe that's a strong word, but was entertaining. And I liked it because I think that's the only time in like a major Hollywood film where a short seller is the good guy. Like normally, it's someone rooting for the home prices to collapse. That's kind of a funny. Like normally, you wouldn't think that would work as a protagonist. But yeah, I don't recall them mentioning the Fed at all in that film. And also, yeah, my problem with the ratings is they made it look just like with the greed. Like, yeah, you can attribute to greed, but that's sort of like blaming a plane crash on gravity or something. It's like, yeah, but why? Right now,
a great metaphor for it.
By the way, someone's going to say I stole that. I swear I independently had been using that, and then apparently some other economists used that, and I actually recently on Twitter we argued about this, and people were saying that I probably read it when I was younger and forgot. I mean, I can't
probably
disprove
I mean,
that,
almost all of my lines are unintentionally borrowed from other people that
I'm still maintaining that I made that up independently. But anyway, yeah, as far as the ratings agencies, even there. Like they were making it sound like, oh, it's just a simple matter of the big boys go down to S&P or Fitch or whatever, Moody's, and just pay them a bunch of money and they get AAA. But it's like, okay, so then why doesn't everybody do that? And why doesn't that happen all the time? Like, why is it that it seems like the ratings agencies were really asleep at the wheel in this cycle? And there's lots that we could get into, but one thing in terms of the government regulation that I've pointed out that I haven't seen other people make is you'd say, okay, fine, suppose that's just total market failure or whatever, but you would think, okay, after the fact, when these agencies that had given AAA to some of this stuff that clearly turned out to, not be AAA, they should have all, lost market share and, other agency, but that can't happen because a lot of the, regulations that are in place in the financial sector say to, certain pension funds or whatever, you have to hold securities that are at least A plus rating from blah, blah, blah. You get what I'm saying? Like, you can't just be like, oh yeah, your Uncle Joe, as long as he says the thing is safe, you can invest the pension in that. No. And so there's built-in guaranteed demand for the services of these particular agencies, ratings agencies that, so even if they do screw up after the fact, it's not like all the government regulations were changed to say, oh no, now you don't need ratings from Moody's or Fitch because they obviously screwed up. In between 03 and 07. So anyway, I'm just saying like it's still not a free market, and I'm not trying to use a, no true Scotsman way to get out of it, but it really is like it's such a highly regulated market. It's kind of crazy to say that's capitalism for you.
It's a state granted oligopoly, and not just in the ratings agencies, but also in the banking sector to a large extent. I mean, they get to. Especially after 08, my goodness, they decided which banks failed and which ones survived. So yeah, I mean, it's just a lie. It's a lie to pretend that this is a free market. It's so far from one. that it's really infuriating that all of the consequences of centrally planned, economies are blamed on greed and capitalism. And it's like, dude, you couldn't be more wrong. But yes, you're right. It does run afoul of the No True Scotsman stuff. And it's like, but I'm just telling you the truth, though. I promise you this isn't a free market. I worked in it. I worked under the Bureau of Real Estate in California. It's an absolute nightmare. These people are criminals and they're idiots. I'm sorry to be, whatever, a little bit brazen, but I can't stand these people. And I think that's ultimately why I left the industry, not just the lockdowns, but it was like constant litigation risk for, not crossing your T's and dotting your I's when in reality you've done nothing wrong. In fact, you're, not to toot my own horn, but I genuinely believe I was one of the most honorable people in my industry in that area. And I was just constantly getting audited. And it was like, they don't want private competition to the banking cartel. They don't want it. That's the reality. And I saw it firsthand. So yeah, if you think that this is a free market, you're just wrong. That's the truth.
Yeah, along the lines of what you're saying, that these people are not the sharpest knives in the drawer, because it's partly a selection mechanism too. Like, I think the sharpest people who have a knack for the financial sector, like, they go into the private sector to go make a bunch of money.
They do what I did. They don't go and audit my books.
Yeah, and I can't be specific, but I was talking to this one guy who, he had worked at a major New York City-based investment bank, and he was telling me stories about how the regulators would come in and be looking at their books and whatever to make sure, the requirements for these derivatives, and you got to have this amount and blah, blah, blah. And he was saying, like, it was clear that the people didn't even know what to look at. And, like, his staff kind of had to say, well, no, for that regulation, what you want to see is over here and see how we're in compliance. Like, he's saying they were in compliance, but he said they didn't even need to be. Like, the people checking they didn't even know what they were looking for. They don't know anything. So,
no, they genuinely don't know anything. But this is the really screwed up part about it. If they don't find something wrong, then you don't have to pay for the audit. So they always find something wrong. Always. Like, the most mundane nonsense. I never had a complaint. I never had a lawsuit filed against me. I never had anything. I never had a report to the DRE or the Bureau of Real Estate once it converted over to that. But it didn't matter. They were still coming back. Every couple of years, they'd come and audit me, and they would always find something, some disclosure that was dated. It should have been within 72 hours, and in fact, it was 96 hours. Like, just total ticky-tack garbage. And that's what their job was. Their job was to go around bleeding small businessmen. Like, that's their entire purpose for existence. My disdain for these people is infinite. Genuinely.
What's funny on that is it just reminds me of this phenomenon I've seen. So when I was younger, like in high school, I worked for a grocery chain, Wegmans, if people have heard that in the Northeast, and it was like the health inspectors were coming through or something, and everybody was getting their ducks in a row and just making sure, because the health inspectors are coming through, and some guy made some remark like, "Oh yeah, last year these people are so ridiculous," because they were going through the bakery, and they saw that the guy was like taking the stuff out of the oven, and he turned and one of the rolls fell on the floor, and he picked it up and put it on the counter, and he was going to throw it out, and they dinged him thinking, well, no, it's for all we know, you're going to sell that. And so they got, so like we were all, and the guy was complaining. And so at the time I was definitely a radical libertarian. I don't know if I probably wasn't an anarcho-capitalist at that point, but I was, along the way I was going down the slide. And so I kind of raised the issue of like, yeah, I wonder about, these whether you need the health department or not. And the guy, he immediately said something like, well, no, I mean, I'm glad you need those people because of these other businesses. In other words, it was like everybody knows the government regulation of their individual business is stupid right. And is, hindering their ability to serve their customers. But yet a lot of them are still glad that those regulators are out there from these, vague other businesses who are real, shadowy and would do all these horrible things were it not for these noble regulators that I agree whenever I interact with them, they're incompetent and arbitrary.
Yeah, you got to have them for the bad guys, of course. Yeah, I mean that's the frustration of it, and California is just being overran by regulatory agencies and so many. I mean, and not to mention taxes and just the lockdown era. Like the list of restrictions that have been put on, particularly small businesses in California, is so overwhelming, and that's why you've seen such a mass exodus from California. I mean, tremendous exodus of the productive class. I'm not talking about the laboring class or the, even the welfare class. I'm talking about the people that actually create jobs, like the people you really, really want to have, and California doesn't want them. So we'll see how that lasts long term, but I would bet it ain't going to be pretty.
Before we pivot away from the real estate stuff, what's your thought? Because it is a bit of a, I don't know if puzzle's the right word, but mortgage rates have come way up, and yet, normally you would expect housing prices to come down in response, and yet that hasn't happened. Yeah. So I've heard some theories, but do you want to take a shot at that? Like, sure. What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, I'll acknowledge that my prediction was wrong. I thought I was very concerned in 2020, like the beginning of lockdowns, as a mortgage lender with a book with hundreds of millions of dollars of mortgages sitting out there. I was horrified. I thought the world was ending. But I also, at the same time, who could have possibly known that they were going to print trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars and just flood the zone to keep the economy alive? Certainly not me. I didn't think that they could go that far. I mean, people forget because these numbers are so extraordinary, but $800 billion was the TARP bailout in 2008, and that was the biggest ever. And now we're talking magnitudes higher, like 4, 5x, just numbers that 15, 20 years ago were unfathomable. So anyways, that's what happened is essentially because they created all of these bailout programs, not just for businesses, but they did the foreclosure and eviction moratorium. They extended unemployment insurance to keep people, even when their tenants, paying their rent. But the foreclosure and eviction moratorium in particular really screwed up the market. It kept it so that there was, anybody, even if they were non-performing, totally outside of the pandemic issue and the lockdowns, they were able to stay in that house for a year or 2 years. Once you do that, it keeps a massive amount of inventory that ought to be hitting the market. It keeps it off the market. What does that mean? It means that you're going to drive up prices because supply is artificially reduced because of government intervention in the market. So that's what happened, is that you had this, and because of that, you still had people that were buying. So it was like, it just kept driving down supply. So supply got to essentially record lows. I think there was for over a year, it was like 1 million units inventory sitting out there. And that is crazy low. I mean, normally it's 4 or 5 million units that are sitting for sale. So, and then on top of that, you also had the artificially reduced interest rates, and you had, the BlackRocks and the State Streets and the Vanguards that were out buying up huge tranches of single-family properties to turn into rentals. I mean, it's a confluence of factors that ultimately delayed the day of reckoning. But now that interest rates have been spiked from, the zero bound up to 5%, so mortgage rates went from 3.25% up to 7.5 or 8. You are seeing softness in many markets, and I think that is healthy. It's what's necessary. I mean, aside from going to hard money, which would be ideal, I think that this is absolutely what has to happen. That Powell has to stay with the program and try and keep rates here and ultimately force a deflationary period in this country. And if he doesn't, then we're going hyperinflation. But if he does, we're probably not able to maintain ourselves and our national debt and the interest on that. So it's they're walking a razor's edge. I have no idea how they're going to make it work.
Let me ask you one more. I've heard a theory that would explain. So yeah, it was that last part that I was curious about in particular. Where once mortgage rates started rising and pretty rapidly, you would have thought real estate would come way down, and that didn't happen, at least thus far. Like, yeah, there's softening, but you might have thought it would be a sharper fall. And anecdotally, I've talked to a bunch of different, like realtors and such, and they're saying, and so I'm wondering if you think this makes any sense, at least to explain some of the timing. They were saying, yeah, it's this paradoxical thing where because mortgage rates rose so quickly, there's a bunch of people who had a really nice mortgage rate, and normally there would have been turnover, like, they would have taken a different job offer or whatever, and they're not willing to sell because, no, I don't want to give up this mortgage rate right now. So it's this weird thing where because mortgage rates went up, the supply of homes for sale
went down,
artificially went down, and that kept the price from falling.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes perfect sense. Like, if you've locked your mortgage in at 3 and an 8, 3.25, you're never leaving. Not if you have to transition into an 8% 30-year mortgage. Like, no way. We're talking thousands of dollars additional monthly expenditure. So those people they're not going to move. They're not going to sell unless they lose their jobs or interest rates come down. That's what's going to happen. So I think that it's more likely that they will lose their jobs. I think that this economy is a house of cards. I think that the banking sector is sitting on untold, losses because of exactly what we're describing here, is that the banks, using their capital reserves, they acquired tons of long-term debt instruments, most of them being treasuries, but lots of mortgage-backed securities and things like that. And all of those are in the red because they bought them at par when it was the Fed funds rate was near zero, and now the Fed funds rate's at 5. So they've lost. I mean, they're sitting on paper losses to the tune of over $500 million or $500 billion, according to reports yesterday. I think that the untold losses that they're sitting on are far larger than that. So I don't know. It's a very dangerous game with the highest of stakes.
Mm-hmm. Among other things, the Federal Reserve is insolvent as we speak.
Yes.
I've covered this here and then on the Human Action podcast, but for folks just that when you have a fixed income instrument and then interest rates rise, the market value of it goes down. And so since the Fed just was going out and buying all sorts of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, and now interest rates went up, so technically
they're sitting on losses too.
They had unrealized losses that are way higher than what their equity was. And so, in a formal accounting sense, they are insolvent. It doesn't matter because they don't care. And
they got the printing press, but the banks don't.
Yeah.
I mean, the other banks don't. So, and they are sitting on, comparable losses. Some of them worse, probably. I mean, not in terms of some, but in terms of percentage of their book.
Right.
So it's like, yeah, I mean, there's just once you have government interference into the economy, particularly on the money level, which is like the lubricant to the economy, it's like you can't evaluate anything. I mean, this is the other reason that I shut down my company, is that, not just because of the lockdowns, not just because of the foreclosure and eviction moratorium, and not just because of the regulatory issues from the state of California, but I was a fiduciary to my investors. I have to put their interests ahead of my own. How could I possibly, in good faith, advise them to continue to deploy capital in a market that is impossible to read? I mean, we're talking about okay, it should have been a recession. That's what should have happened. There should have been a very, very severe recession from 2020 through 2022, probably because of the stupid lockdown program. Instead, they papered over it and delayed the day of reckoning. And it's like, well, I can't possibly evaluate risk and advise people with liability put on my shoulders, given that I have no idea what Powell's going to do or what Yellen's going to do or Biden's going to do or Trump's going to do. I have no idea what these people are going to do. So we don't have a free market. There's no way you can, in good faith, advise as a financial advisor in a fiduciary role without lying through your teeth, or you're just an idiot. So you tell them that everything's fine when you don't know, because you don't know. And I think that's the reality, is that most financial advisors don't know. They just go, this system, sure, some of them may know that it's somewhat broken, but they have no idea to the depth that it is because they don't have the Austrian economics background.
Yeah, I think there's that. And then also, too, I think there's a mentality of, well, if the crowd is going along with it, I can't be blamed. The world could always blow up, and an asteroid could hit us next Thursday, ha ha.
Right.
And so, what's the point of worrying about the dollar crashing? Because
this is a little bit more probable than an asteroid hitting us tomorrow.
Yeah,
this is like an inevitability. So if you understand that, then it's like you can't continue to participate in this charade. And that's basically the realization that I had, because I didn't realize that the federal government was willing to intervene in the economy in such a fashion, like not to that scale. It was just so extraordinary. So once you realize that, it's like, oh, it's over. Like we're in a centrally planned economy now. Like it doesn't matter how smart you are, how good you are. Yeah, you could be smart enough to hedge your way into some sort of relative safety or security. But I was just investing in trust deeds. I was just helping people, get a conservative loan to value on a commercial property or a single family. And at that point, it was like, all right, this is the end of the game here. And I think a lot of people in my industry, made the same calculation. And a lot of them didn't, because they're greedy and they're scumbags and they're dumb. Sorry to be mean, but that's the truth. I worked in the industry, and many of them are exactly that. So all of the good, basically what I'm saying is all of the good people have left. It's just the bad people that are still doing it, which is not a good sign.
So we've got about 13 minutes left here, and I know I got to let you go. We did the broccoli, and now let's get into the dessert. So tell us about you. How did you find yourself as a VP candidate for the Libertarian Party?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I didn't want to do it. I very much didn't want to, but I got involved with the Mises Caucus and the Libertarian Party takeover because of Dave Smith, because I was a huge fan of his, and the insinuation was that he was going to run for president. So I was like, let's see what we can do. I was a delegate for Florida. I went to Reno in 22. We took the party over. Everything seems to be going swimmingly. Dave's family situation changes. He decides he's not going to do it. And, Heiss and Scott and a bunch of other people start reaching out to me late last summer. And they're like, hey, man, just want to see what you think. Like, are you interested? And for the record, like they were lobbying me to run for president, to basically take exactly what Dave was doing and to go for it. And I was like, guys, I just started. Like, I was supposed to be 5th chair on Timcast IRL. So I was planning to move to West Virginia, or then a few weeks later that falls apart because we couldn't come to terms. And I end up being co-host on a show with Luke Radowski and right in my backyard. And it's like, I can't do that. I can't do that role service and continue to take on all of these side projects that I'm trying to turn into real businesses. So no, essentially I say no. And then, Heiss hits me up a month later. He says, okay, we got Rechtenwald to go for it. And we're curious if you would like to run for VP. Of all the people that are going to potentially do that, no one has the reach you do. No one has, the fans and the audience and things that you've been able to put together in a relatively short amount of time. So like, we think that you'd be a really big asset to the party and to the messaging and to the Mises Caucus and to the Ron Paul Revolution 2.0. And I was like, I'm in, let's do it. So that's how it came to pass. I was a surrogate for Dave Smith as is usually the case.
Okay. All right. So, okay, that's good. So then, I know you've told various versions of the story, but can you give us the quick version of what the heck happened
at
the convention?
I mean, well, the short of it is that I lost. Very, very close. It was 47% to 51 or 50.4 or something like that. It was really, really close. But the in my opinion, the more sinister aspects of how that all came to pass was that there was a lot of dilatory action. Like, people were just trying to delay the voting on both the president and the vice president. So the presidential nomination happened around 5 p.m. on Sunday. It was supposed to happen 4 or 3 p.m. on Saturday. So it was delayed over 24 hours. And the VP nomination process didn't happen until after midnight Monday. I mean, it was crazy. So 30%, or at least 20%, 20 to 30% left of the delegates left because so they weren't there because they all had to go back to work on Monday. They had to catch flights and stuff like that. So it ended up being a skeleton crew, and God bless the people that hung around. I'll forever be in their debt that they stuck with me. Many of them, I'm sure, skipped work and missed flights and did all sorts of stuff to try and make it happen. But our opposition party was a combination of Chase Oliver and Mike Tremont, which made an alliance in the 23rd hour. They were both losing to Michael Rechtenwald, and after like 4 or 5 rounds of voting, they essentially create like I said, a 23rd hour alliance. And Oliver, who's in second place, offers Tremont his VP slot. Then Tremont asks, the Rechtenwald team, hey, we'd prefer to go with you. How about you give us the VP slot? That's supposed to be me. So Dave and Heiss and everybody else turns around to me and they go, Clint, are you okay with that? And after about 20 seconds, I go, yeah, actually I am. I'm okay with that. Let's keep the movement alive. Let's have one presidential ticket we're not totally embarrassed by, and I can go back to living my life, because that would be preferable to me anyways. So, but then after 20 seconds after I agree to it, Mr. Tremont turns around and says, I'm going with Chase Oliver anyways. And he screws over the entire Mises Caucus. So that's how it played out. It was pretty dirty pool, but this was my first foray into politics, and I came away as unimpressed with politics as I was before I had even started.
So I've heard various versions of that story from people, admittedly like the people I like, and you and Dave telling it on Part of the Problem and whatnot. Help me out though. Something I don't fully get. It's not right that that people vote for the president and then the president gets to say who my VP is, right? Those are strictly speaking, those are separate decisions.
Correct. No, the delegates get to decide. So what happened was, because basically they were just saying, we will make you our preferred vice presidential candidate. So we will, all of our delegates, like, because this vote just happened, or this vote is about to happen, assuming we win, that means that we have the numbers to get me over the finish line. So if I get up there and I say, hey, I want this guy to be my VP, you would think that the delegates are going to say, okay, let's give him, I mean, we chose him, we're going to give him what he wants. But because of, some of the difference of fanfare or support for what I was doing, it ended up being razor thin. I mean, like they really played with fire. It could have been Chase Oliver as president and me as VP with the craziest ticket in history as far as I'm concerned. But it was this close to happen. I'm not even exaggerating. I think it was 32 delegate votes. Like, that's how close. So basically had 17 people gone for me instead of Termott, that it would have flipped.
That's okay. So is this correct that strictly speaking, so for one thing is the delegates are allowed to vote for whoever they want. It's not like they're duty bound. Okay. So
bound.
Strictly speaking, what happened is, there were some delegates that Chase was their first pick. They didn't like Rectenwald, and there were some people that liked Termott, and basically Chase let it be known that, hey, you guys who right now wish Termott would be the president, he and I both agree. Yep. You should join my delegates.
Exactly.
Put me over the hump so I knock Rectenwald out and beat none of the above.
Yep.
And then in the next vote, all of my, I'm telling all my delegates to vote support Termott for the VP to make sure he can edge out this Clint Russell character. Is that correct? Okay.
That's exactly right. Yes. But it wasn't just like, I'll tell my delegates. He also gave a speech, which I didn't know was part of the rules. So my speech was cut down from 10 minutes to 1 minute, and then he gets to have 5 minutes to go up there and tell people why they ought to support Termott. And I was like, well, this seems very unfair. Fortunately, Dave, being the legend that he is, he stays up until 12:30 on Monday to give the speech to try and get me across the finish line. And but because it was cut from 10 minutes to 1 minute because everyone was so exhausted, I didn't get to speak at all. Dave only gets to speak for 65, 70 seconds. And it's like that was our whole pitch. I mean, it was just, needless to say, the deck was stacked against us at that point. It was very, very challenging to prevail. But it came very close. I think the most, delegate votes that Rectenwald ever got was like 42 or 43. And I got 40, or I'm not even sure he got that many. Maybe he did, but I got 47. So it was close, very, very close.
Okay. So big picture, I don't know if this is an unfair. Is it the kind of thing where you guys could have seen this coming, or is it more like, well, yeah, if they're willing to kick us in the nuts, then I guess they can do that, but we just wouldn't do that. Like I don't want to win that way. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm not equipped for politics. Let's just be honest. Like I don't play the dirty dealing stuff. Like that's not how I did business. The whole reason I had a successful career is because I did what I said I was going to do, and like I came through on promises, and that's it. That's my approach to the world, to business, to everything. So when it came to politics, it was the same thing. I told everybody the truth all the time. I never lied. I never deceived. I never tried to soft sell or nothing. I was just like, I'm going to tell you the truth. That is my entire pitch to you. No politician will ever do that for you. So if you're actually serious about having someone that will tell you the truth, that's who I am. So like what they did wasn't even like, it's not the highest level. Like it's not the DNC rigging the system against Bernie Sanders. It's not the GOP rigging the system against Ron Paul. It's just a 23rd hour flip. Termott had told the Rectenwald team that he preferred him forever and ever. And then he changed his mind at the last second because he thought it was the best bet he had to get across the finish line, I assume. I assume that was his calculation. So that's that. It's it's his decision to make, and it's his life to live with. He's got to feel how that feels. So,
Well, let me clarify. I don't just mean about the last minute, the wheeling and dealing, but I just mean because you mentioned it briefly, and I heard stuff about, there was something like with the extensions and people changed the rules and other people didn't realize what was going on, and that was kind of railroaded through.
Yeah, I honestly I can't remember all of the details of the weekend because I was given speeches and doing my podcast with Luke and stuff like that. So I don't know all of the ins and outs as to any of the shenanigans. I do know that there was screenshots of, I don't know if it was text messages or a Discord channel that said stall, do whatever you have to do, create havoc, destroy the place. Like, so this was a concerted effort, whether or not I'm reading into it properly, that they were trying to delay until delegates left because they thought that their people would be able to stick around longer than ours. I can't say 100% certainty, but I don't understand the purpose of delaying as aggressively as they did if that's not the angle that you're taking, given that these are like the last things that are going to be voted on. And it's really the only thing they won too. So that's the other reason that I feel like that's exactly what they were doing, is they lost 80% of the board to the Mises Caucus. So it's like there was a reason for the delay. And the only thing that they won was the presidential and vice presidential ticket. So, golf clap, well played. Like that, that was their game plan, and it worked.
Yeah. So I guess just we're wrapping up here.
Actually, by the way, I do have a few more minutes. So if you want to extend,
okay.
It's okay. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess I'm certainly not the first person to notice this, but it is ironic that the allegation all along from many critics on the left was, this Mises Caucus thing, it's all a Trojan horse. These guys just like Donald Trump, and then when Dave, did his, actually, he turns out, funny thing, I'm not running. And then everyone was just convinced of this group. And yet when it comes down to it, the best gift the LP could have given to the Trump campaign was to put up
Chase Oliver,
the ticket that they did. Whereas if it was Rechtenwald and you, then some libertarians might have, some right-leaning libertarians would have voted for you guys. So I don't know, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think you laid out the case quite well. Their whole thesis is nonsense. It's always been nonsense. If I wanted to be a Republican, I would have been a Republican. The only time I voted for the Republicans was when Ron Paul was running. I am a libertarian, for real. I know a lot of people think I'm just some Trojan horse plant for Donald Trump. It's not true. It's not at all true. I'm furious about what happened in 2020. Genuinely, not performatively. I am absolutely activated for the rest of my existence over how inhumane and evil everything was during that year. And Trump bears a huge amount of responsibility for that. But they didn't want me to be the messenger going around on the biggest podcast talking about that. They wanted Chase Oliver to be out there talking about, whether or not kids can take hormones. Okay, congrats. You just handed millions of votes to Donald Trump. That's what y'all did, not what we did. So, you point a finger at me, four more pointed back at you, I guess is how it works.
Mm-hmm. So I guess last question for you is, what do you see in the future? Do you think there's going to be a big real estate or broader crash, or do you think it's just going to be a slow motion train wreck? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is why I close my business, is that there's, everyone can give predictions, but they don't know, because the reality is that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury and the federal government have immense power, just absolutely enormous power, to the tunes of just creating trillions of dollars out of thin air. So I can't say definitively, but I can say that there is no good outcome with this. There is no soft landing. You're going to have either you maintain interest rates where they're at, or you continue to increase them to try and fight the inflationary pressure, or you reverse course because the banking sector is going to implode with interest rates at these levels if it's maintained much longer. So you reverse course, you drop back to the zero bound, you rejuice the economy, you start QE, you start printing again, you just launch us into hyperinflation. Okay, either way, it's going to be absolutely vicious for the average person and the unprepared. So instead of giving a prediction, I would just say, if you haven't hedged at this point, you're making a huge mistake. Personally, precious metals, Bitcoin, I think, is the inflationary hedge. The deflationary hedge is cash, and no libertarian ever talks about that. But I think that if you don't have cash, at least have access to lines of credit, so that if I'm right and that there is the potential for, because of the banking sector's insolvency on the books, I mean, it's not realized yet, but many of these institutions are in fact insolvent. We could see a repeat of 0809, in which case you will be you will be very, very upset if you do not have access to cash at that time to be able to purchase, your first home or whatever, or your fifth home, depending on where your economic status is. So I think that that's the key, is that we don't know the timing. We just know that it's going to be bad. I know that's a very dire way to put it, but it's the truth.
Yeah, and it's funny you say. So I'm in agreement with everything you just said. And actually, years ago, my co-author at the time, Carlos Lara, and we had a 3-pronged strategy, and one of the components was to accumulate cash. And we were saying, if you need something, we were saying like a month's worth of expenses, like austerity budget kind of stuff, because they might have a bank holiday. We were just going through the various things that could happen. And what's funny with this stuff too, so I'm sure you've run into this too, this last thing here, and I'll let you go, Clint, is people will say like, oh, just, you guys are perma bears or what. And yeah, I get it. Like if somebody just has been saying, oh, there's going to be a crash, since 1971, the dollar's going to disappear. Like, yeah, at some point you got to say, well, maybe my timing is off, or the world doesn't work the way I think. Right. But on the other hand, if somebody was warning about using hydrogen blimps, and there wasn't a blow up the next Thursday, like that doesn't mean they were wrong, or somebody who was looking at the O-rings on the space shuttle and saying, this is not safe. It's if they had just a few flights, it's not like, oh, you were, Chicken Little over here. I mean, you can point to a situation that is not sustainable and is dangerous without being on the hook for knowing the exact time frame that it's going to happen. You could still be right in your warnings about,
Exactly.
This is not a safe situation.
Yeah, I mean, just to, show my my credentials when it comes to not being a perma-bear. From 2009 through 2013, I was personally buying real estate as aggressively as possible, and I was telling everybody that I knew to do so. So for a 5-year period, in the beginning of my career, I was telling everybody I knew, go get a house right now. It's the best opportunity you will ever have in your life. And very few people took me up on that, because very few people had cash, which is exactly what I'm talking about. If you don't have a down payment, or if you don't have enough cash to buy a house outright, you're not going to be a player. So like that's the key, is make sure your credit's in order, make sure that you have enough cash for a down payment, and then have hedges for the hyperinflation, death of the dollar scenario that is a potentiality. It really is. I mean, the BRICS rise is not a joke. So like this can go one of two very, very vicious ways. So that's been, as someone who was a fiduciary and a, fairly successful investor myself, like that's what I'm doing personally. So I'm just practicing what I preach. This is not financial advice, by the way, you guys do your own research, but that's my honest opinion as to what we ought to be doing, is hedge both ways and then speak out and try and educate people as much as possible as to why this paradigm exists, why it doesn't have to, and how we might avoid it being our continuous cycle for the rest of our existence. Right.
And among other things, so that when it does crash, if it does, then people don't just get to blame it on unregulated greed and say, no, that's not what caused it. We've been saying, well, that's a good place to wrap up. So, Clint, you've alluded to a few of your outlets for people who are intrigued by you and they're not familiar. Where do they go to hear more of what you do?
Yeah, Liberty Lockdown on all the platforms, YouTube, everywhere. It's also obviously a podcast, so if you pick up your phones and search for that, you will find it. Liberty Lockdown. I also do the Best Political Show over on Rumble with Luke Radowski. It's all one word, We Are Change. That's it. Those are the two main outlets, and then we'll see what my involvement is with the Libertarian Party moving forward. But I continue to, I'm going to continue to do what I do and try and get our message out as best as I can. And we'll see where the chips may fall.
Okay, great. Well, my guest has been Clint Russell, everybody. So, Clint, thanks so much for your time and your insights.
Appreciate you, Bob. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.